Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for showing up. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Terrill. He received his bachelor's and master's from Arizona State University, where he studied warbler migration. And then he went to SUNY Albany, where he studied social dominance, migration, and energetics of dark-eyed juncos. Then he went on to become a von Humboldt Fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, basically studying avian migration again. So he spent a lot of his time studying how birds move around the planet. And after that, he worked some jobs, but now he's the vice president and senior ornithologist for H.T. Harvey and Associates, which was started by Jim Harvey's father, Tom. And it's a really interesting ecological company because they do applied ecology for consulting, but they also do basic research. So they have a lot of funded work where they're just studying marine systems. And another thing to note about Scott is he's probably one of the best bird identifiers I've ever met by sight or sound. And he spent about 5 decades looking at seabirds in the California Current and elsewhere. So with that, I will let him tell you all about what he's going to talk about.
Okay, well, thanks, Stephanie. I appreciate that introduction very much. And I also want to express that I appreciate the opportunity to work for Harvey and Associates, like Stephanie said, was started by Jim's dad. And the company has carried this philosophy of doing basic research through the 40 years it's been around. And we do take NSF funding and NOAA funding, and we have for years, especially David Ainley, who basically started the Farallon Island program and the Seabird program for what's now Point Blue. We used to be Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and David's been working with us for about 20 years now. So a lot of the information I'm going to tell you about data is David Ainley's data, or data that is associated with a lot of work that David's done. So today I want to just briefly give you an introduction to the sort of renewable energy policy scape and kind of what's going on in California in terms of initiatives to basically push or to elevate offshore wind in the state. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the potential environmental issues and data that's available to help to address some of these issues in birds in particular, since that's my area of expertise. And then talk a little bit about data gaps and approaches to filling those. I am going to just briefly touch on some other taxa and some of the issues that may be associated with those taxa, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I just want to sort of introduce those to you. Since you're marine scientists, they're probably already obvious to you anyway. So California has a very ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goal. Oh, okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, Scott.
Yeah.
You don't need to talk to the microphone either.
Okay. Okay. I can walk around? Okay. All right. I appreciate that. I think I head over to the pizza. Yeah, California's 2030 and 2020 goals are quite ambitious. 33% by 2020 and 50% by 2030. That's, I'm sorry, 33% and 50% by 2030 of California's electricity will be derived from renewable sources. And then there are several other approaches to reducing greenhouse gases, reduction of petroleum use, efficiency, more plantings to help with carbon sequestration and reducing climate pollutants. And the realized and potential renewable energy sources, of course, are solar, geothermal, hydro, wind, terrestrial and offshore, and marine hydrokinetic, tidal and wave. Both tidal and wave have been in sort of at the federal level have been a policy issue for quite a while. There are wave and tidal energy developments in Europe, and there's a permit was just finally submitted for a test site off Oregon, off Coos Bay, which is going to be used to test different wave energy devices to see how they perform. That would be the first wave energy project in North America. And so that's proceeding. It's taking a long time, honestly, to permit them because the agencies, there's some unknowns in terms of these devices in the water, and the agencies wanted to be sure and examine those issues thoroughly. So right now in California, wind and solar account for almost 70% of the renewable energy, and then the other groups make up the difference. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in 2005 was tasked with permitting offshore energy, whether it be marine hydrokinetic or wind, outside the 3-mile state limit. And we call them BOEM. So BOEM has noted that large segments of the population live on both coasts, and that land-based renewable energy on those coastal areas is limited, at least at this point, and that the offshore wind potential is quite high in a lot of these places, and could provide all the electricity that these coastal cities need, or coastal populations. So, so the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has the regulatory authority to grant leases offshore for projects. So project proponents will they can put in an unsolicited lease request. So if they identify an area of high wind potential that they want to put an offshore wind project, they apply for a lease. The leases can go competitive. Other companies can apply for those as well. And their permitting process really requires, requires three levels or 3 phases during which environmental review takes place. The first one is an assessment for the lease issuance. The second is for the leasee to conduct site characterization, biological and physical characterization of the site. And then the more specific NEPA evaluation is done on a project-specific level. And until quite recently, California wasn't really on the radar for offshore wind until Governor Brown put it on the radar. And he basically did that in 2015. In 2016, especially when he requested the Department of Interior Secretary to form a joint task force, a federal-state task force, to coordinate state and federal planning for offshore wind off California. And it was created in 2016. So why does California look so attractive? Well, the wind resource up in the north, whoops, oh, what did I do? There we go. I should wear my glasses. You can see that, so valuable wind resources really above 8. Below 8 it's workable, but above 8 is good. And anything above at 10 or above is really good, exceptional. So we have this area off the northern California coast, and some areas off the east coast, but very far offshore, where the offshore wind resource is quite promising. Now, one of the things that's come up very recently is that when the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the state, CEC, California Energy Commission, talked to the Department of Defense, the Department of Defense said, No. No wind energy projects from here to here because of concerns about impacts to the military operations. So right now, there's sort of a gold rush for off Humboldt. And so that's right now the Redwood Coast Energy Authority is put together a team to explore the possibilities of developing a wind project off Humboldt. Just so you know, virtually all the offshore wind that's been developed is in Europe. It's off the coast of Europe, and it's quite a lot. It's almost 16 gigawatts at the end of 2017, and they're developing quickly. They developed 3 gigawatts in 2017 alone. And at this point, there's one project in North America, and that's the Block Island Wind Farm off Rhode Island, which went operational in 2016. It's important to note, and I'm going to be stressing this a bit more for biological reasons, to note that the current offshore wind projects are in relatively shallow water and they're anchored, or they're embedded in the substrate. So, you know, we've got obviously different structures with respect to depth. And right now what they're looking at off California is development off the outer continental shelf in deep water. So all of those platforms are going to be floating platforms. So I don't have to tell this audience that there's a tremendous difference between the bathymetry off California and that off Europe or the Atlantic, where there's a long, broad shelf with not a lot of topography, whereas California, of course, has a narrow shelf, and it's just riddled with topography. So what about these offshore floating wind turbines? Well, Principal Power has deployed a full-scale 2-megawatt wind float off Portugal. And this is the first offshore floating wind platform that's actually been deployed. And it managed to survive pretty severe conditions of very high seas, waves over 17 meters, and winds exceeding 60 knots, and was able to survive. So, and right now, Principal Power is the company that's been selected by the Redwood Coast Energy Authority to pursue a lease off Humboldt with the authority. Whoops. Sorry about this. I don't know what I did. Okay. Sorry about that. So in terms of environmental effects, the agencies that are primarily involved at the federal level are the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the Department of Energy, and at the state level, the California Energy Commission. And there are a couple of labs that are quite involved, the Pacific Northwest National Lab and NERL, the Lab for Renewable Energy, National Lab. And Annex 4 published a State of Science report in 2016. Annex 4 is a group of 12 countries that want to advance the the understanding of environmental issues that are associated with offshore wind, and make everything, all the publications, all the research, and they also support research available to the public. And at the end of the talk, I'll give you a few links, but if you're interested in more information about all of this, then Tethys, and I'll show you that later. Tethys is the place to go. It's an information gold mine online. So Well, one of the first things in terms of both marine hydrokinetic and offshore wind is potential entanglement associated with the devices. We don't know to what degree this is going to be an issue with offshore wind or marine hydrokinetics. Right now, PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab, is doing a lot of modeling. But, you know, the idea is that these animals could become impinged or entangled in the structure mooring, or perhaps more likely, probably more likely, they could get entangled in loose gear that gets caught up in the devices or in the mooring. Anyway, the key animals that are of concern are large cetaceans off, out in the OCS, and pinnipeds, et cetera, in nearshore environments, and seabirds and fish. Anyway, there's a fairly robust literature on cetacean entanglement, and I know I'm not a cetacean biologist, but I know that the entanglement has become an increasing issue, at least off California. Underwater noise, something else that's being considered. This underwater noise, I mean, could cause some impacts in terms of hearing, harm to tissues, behavioral changes, et cetera. The sort of the current thought is that we need more data on how on the nature of the sounds that are going to be generated by these devices, as well as the receptors on the animals of concern. And there's a robust literature on this too. But the National Lab still thinks that we need more information. Okay. So, the issue of electromagnetic fields has come up because the cables that are transmitting the power from these devices do create an EMF around those transmission lines. And this was one of the early issues that was looked at fairly carefully. And at this point, the consensus is that EMF is not going to be a big issue. That EMF will not be created to the level that will cause major issues. And the TETHES cites 111 papers on EMFs. Now, a lot of that work it's been both lab and field work. And of course, you can get changes in habitat, especially with structure in the water, whether it's if you have structure on the bottom, right, or if it's a floating platform. It can attract fish, it gets fouled and all of that. So, but the thought is that the attractive nature of the structure won't cause negative significant impacts. Okay, so to my area expertise. Obviously, there's two sort of levels of concern. Maybe not obviously, but there are two levels with birds. A lot of land birds migrate at night, and in some parts of the world, they migrate over large bodies of water. And so that is a concern in some areas. The major issues for both marine birds and terrestrial birds are what's the probability of collision with the turbines, and displacement, right? Are the birds going to have to avoid these wind farms? And lighting. Static white light attracts birds at night, both marine and terrestrial birds, and can cause them to approach structures. Boats, for example, squid boats and other boats, marine birds crash into them at night because of the lighting. And the same with land birds, but they don't respond to strobe or dynamic lighting, especially if it's in the colored spectrum like red or green. So there are ways to work with the Coast Guard and Navy and et cetera to create lights that would be barely bird safe. But it's something we need to examine. So in terms of migrant terrestrial birds, they're a lot more of an issue in the Atlantic North Sea and in the Gulf of Mexico. And I had already mentioned a lot of these birds migrate at night when they're susceptible to night lighting, as well as if they get out over a body of water like an ocean, if they run into inclement weather, then they try to go down. And so for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, where the oil platforms are, you can get 1,000 birds landing on these oil platforms at night if there's a change in weather. These birds launch from the Mexican side and on favorable winds, and they head towards the Gulf, towards Texas and Louisiana. And if a front comes through and they have headwinds, then they go down. So in a case like the North Sea, where you get millions of birds migrating from the north across the North Sea on the way south in the fall and vice versa in the spring, you have wind projects out there. It's an issue. It's definitely an issue. But in terms of North America, the major migration route is in the fall, it's northwest to southeast. In the spring, it's southeast to northwest. There's no land mass out here for these birds to want to go to. So there are potential issues if you have offshore wind farms here, or even in the Atlantic to some degree, because some species like blackpoll warblers breed all the way to Alaska. They migrate to the northeast coast where they get fat. They double, triple their weight with fat, and then they use that fat to fly over water all the way to Venezuela. And there are a few other birds that migrate over the water too. But in California, there's no reason to migrate out over the water, right? So they want to go southeast in the fall, and they come up. They do go northwest in the spring, but there's no reason for them to migrate out over the Pacific. Sometimes birds do get out of the ocean. It's a fairly rare, land birds, a fairly rare event. It's primarily weather dependent. So general considerations for seabirds, we just talked about this, but collision, displacement, and functional habitat loss as a result of displacement. Lighting and spills, of course, that might be associated with deployment or service of devices. So there's been quite a few studies in Europe, the effects on birds. They've been obviously, because these projects are all in the very nearshore environment, shallow water. That's where the studies have been. And there has been a tendency for some people to want to extrapolate from those results to offshore California. And it's understandable because those people don't know a lot about seabirds. And so, it's only natural for them to say, well, the studies have been done already on seabirds in Europe, it's been done, so what's the issue? Well, the issue is that there are some major differences involving the species of birds both in the nearshore and offshore environment in California. Now, some of the information from the nearshore in Europe and the Atlantic can be used for some of the same species that are here, perhaps, but it's a whole different environment. So one of the first things that needs to be done is to develop risk models for the birds in the OCS off California, and not, since the vast majority of these species aren't in nearshore environments in the Atlantic, we need to look, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why those differences are important. But one of the first things we want to do, of course, is identify hotspots. off the coast, where are the big concentrations of seabirds during the various stages in the life cycle. And fortunately, off California, we have quite a lot of data. And especially with all the transects and research vessels that have been going out for many years. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and USGS are still doing surveys, flying areas to look for hotspots. And to borrow the wording from David Ainley, the California current may have the most data of any place in the world on seabird densities, distribution densities, relative abundance, species composition, et cetera. It's based on aerial and ship-based surveys that go back to 1976. Some are still going on, and it's a very rich data set. And just to give you an example, here's a map of hotspots for 16 species. And you can obviously examine single species distribution. This happens to be the distribution of ashy storm petrel. Ashy storm petrel, probably not an issue for offshore wind because they fly very close to the surface. But it's essentially a California endemic. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about it is they breed from Northern California down to Northern Baja. But the densest concentrations at sea are up here, yet the breeding data indicate that the population's basically equally divided between the Channel Islands and Central California. But they, just very quickly, for decades, they came and staged post-breeding at the north rim of the canyon here in large numbers. Well, not large numbers, there's probably only 10 or 12,000 in the world, but they are starting to shift now to off Cordell Bank and between Monterey Bay and Cordell Bank, and even off Half Moon Bay over Pioneer. So I'm not sure what's going on with ashy storm petrels, but we're working on it. We're working on all the data that's available. We're analyzing right now to try to get a population estimate. Anyway, that's a deviation here. That just shows that the birds are starting to switch to Cordell Bank. So the California current, compared to the East Coast in Europe, has a lot more seabirds. It's all that topography, it's the upwelling, and birds come from all over the Pacific off to the shore of Central California. And the species composition over the outer continental shelf involves birds that are called procelarids, and those are albatrosses and shearwaters and petrels. And those birds, I'm going to show you in a minute, those birds are prone to fly high and with high winds. So unlike the birds that are near shore in Europe and here too. The other thing, of course, is that the continental shelf being as narrow as it is off California means that these offshore species are closer to the coast and to project development sites. So the nearshore Atlantic birds typically are things like loons and ducks, cormorants, things like that. And those birds typically flap a lot. They soar very little, and they're very maneuverable because they have, I can't remember if it was a high wing loading or low wing loading, but they fly close to the surface typically, although occasionally during migration loons will fly high, but most of the time they fly close to the water, and they don't get up in the rotor swept zone. The offshore Pacific includes, like I was saying, bowler shearwaters and albatrosses, and you can see the structure of the wings is quite different. These birds are designed to utilize the wind. And the other thing I mentioned is that, of course, a lot of birds come to the California current during the non-breeding season from the southern hemisphere, including sooty shearwaters, pink-footed shearwaters, bowler shearwaters, Wilson's horned petrels, et cetera. And this is just a quick slide of sooty shearwaters that breed in New Zealand with another population at Chile. And I think this is Josh Adams' work. Josh did his master's here, putting tags on sooty shearwater. And actually, my son, when he was in high school, was an intern for Josh and Hannah. So anyway, but one of the things, I'm going to deviate again because I think this is really cool. One of the things that Josh found was that, so you've got the big staging. So these birds breed, they go up off Japan, then they come over to California, and then they go back. And what Josh found is here's, the Chilean population, this is a direct line, right? And you would think that minimizing distance would be favorable, but the Chilean birds did the same thing as the New Zealand birds. They migrated here, and then the Chilean birds went like this. So they went all the way here and there. And if you look at the wind patterns, what they're doing is they're saving energy by using the wind. So it was more efficient for them to go out of the way because of the energy savings of the wind. So, and this is a bird that's going to be of concern to the agencies. There's 2 listed species that are federally listed that occur, both of the short-tailed albatross and Hawaiian petrel. Short-tailed albatross doesn't even occur off California annually. It's very rare, but it's increasing. The population dropped down to like a dozen and off Japan, and they've brought the population back up over 1,000 now, primarily due to the hard work of one Japanese scientist in particular. But this is another really kind of amazing thing. They do occur on the California current, but what's amazing is that these birds breed, so a pair splits the responsibility, right, of taking care of the chick and foraging and bringing food back for the chick. So one member of, and we had no idea this was going on until transmitters, but one member of the pair will take off and head up off Alaska and all the way down off North America, off the California current, and back. And it could be over 10,000 kilometers, or it could be, well, I think that's supposed to be greater than, but anyway, and it takes like 2 weeks, or can. Some of them go up off Japan and do the same thing. And then that bird feeds the chick, and then the other mate pair takes off. So anyway, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, black-footed albatrosses do the same thing, but they're a lot bigger, so they can, you think they can store more food. But these guys do reduce the food down to a very dense oil that they feed the chicks. It's extremely calorically rich. So David Ainley, from about 1976 to 2006, did 114 cruises. These are the cruise lines. He did, along with Larry Spear and some other researchers, they took data on bird flight height as a function of wind speed and direction for all of these species, for all of these areas. So they have a very rich, it's a unique data set. And when David did and et al. Did an analysis, you really can group these birds into 3 categories. One of the flappers, those are the birds that flap constantly, like the loons and ducks that are maneuverable but don't get very high. You've got glide flappers. Those are birds that glide mostly. And those are the birds that are designed to utilize the wind. So they save energy by tacking with the wind, right? So they go up and down as the wind increases, whereas the flappers don't do that. And those are the birds that are on some of those birds over the outer continental shelf. And and flap gliders are sort of intermediate. Okay. Anyway, for these birds that utilize the wind very efficiently, there is a significant increase in flight height as a function of wind speed. So as the wind definitely increases, these birds go much higher. I might add, too, that because of the way these birds are designed to utilize the wind, they're not very good at flying when it's not windy. So they tend just to sit on the water and save energy and wait till the wind picks up. And this is a diagram that sort of illustrates what I'm talking about. And what these birds are doing is called dynamic soaring. And this is what happens when the wind picks up. The birds basically tack and go way up and then down, and they do this over and over and over. And so, there's nothing, these birds don't occur in the nearshore environment, typically. Well, I'm sorry, some do. Off California, for example, sooty shearwaters will arc up when it's windy and they're near shore. But a lot of the dynamic soaring birds are farther offshore. So what we're recommending, and we have proposals into a couple of proposals in actually, is the first step in sort of doing a risk all the transects that have been done for hotspots and species composition. Take and add the data that for those species regarding wind, speed, and flight height, and model that with the windscape off California. And so we can actually look and see how these different species may be responding at different locations off California. Now, we can also would be able to do a probabilistic model on this probability of a bird strike, just get all else being equal. But the first step is just to, I think, is to do this overall modeling off the coast. And we have the data. And we also have on the team a fellow, Jared Santora. I don't know if you know Jared. He's done modeling off the East Coast of the windscape and the bird hotspots there. So risk models are, I think, a necessary first step. We've got the data, and I think we need to do this modeling. But it's really it's important to also note that we don't know how these dynamic soaring birds are going to respond to turbines. What's been found in Europe primarily is that the flappers, the nearshore birds, ducks and loons, et cetera, mostly avoid the wind turbines. And there are some strikes. There hasn't, as far as I know, there hasn't been any kind of there's only been one case of sort of diligent monitoring, which I'll talk about in a minute. Most of the other stuff has been observational, and you can imagine how difficult it is to do fatality searches in the ocean. I mean, for terrestrial wind, people walk the areas below the turbine and look for fatalities. Short of putting, you can't do that. So, but a lot of the observational radar studies have shown that these nearshore birds do avoid turbines, but we want to definitely caution against extrapolating that to the dynamic soars and tube nodes, because there's just no information. So they may avoid them, they may not, they may be different, or it's possible they may fly. So we can do all the modeling, which I think is definitely needed and will be informative in the overall planning and the site analysis. But we're going to, I think, we need to monitor because we don't know how these birds will respond. And monitoring out there would entail rare encounters, at least for some species, if the encounters occur at all. And obviously, compared to the nearshore environment, the offshore over the outer continental shelf is a lot more challenging for any kind of monitoring. So there's a lot of technology development occurring right now in terms of different ways to monitor radar, optical, we'll talk about that, acoustic, vibration sensors. In the offshore environment, the issues of obviously platform stability, et cetera. The Pacific Northwest National Lab, specifically Shari Metzner, is working on a thermal recording device that they're developing the device. It's a thermal sensor, so they can use it day and night. They're training it to identify birds, and they're able to take a series of thermal images to see the flight paths of birds. So that's being developed. It's very promising. As far as I can tell, she gave a talk about a month ago at the California Energy Commission meetings on offshore wind, and it looks very promising. Also, in a collaborative effort between Oregon State and the Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy Center, they are also developing vibration sensors that they put on the turbine blades, and attaching both a visual spectrum camera and a thermal camera. And when they get a strike, then the camera records the strike very quickly, and they're able to see the species. So these are in the lab right now, but just so we're also testing similar systems and terrestrial systems for the Department of Energy right now. Specifically, devices that can detect and identify, for example, a golden eagle approaching a wind farm. And if the eagle gets within a certain envelope of a turbine, then a deterrent signal goes off and scares the eagle away. So, so this technology is being developed, and they actually implemented one in a vibration infrared or thermal sensor vibration detector off Denmark, and it apparently worked quite well. And that thermal detector, as soon as it sees a warm body in a certain zone, it triggers a camera, and the camera takes a picture of whatever the creature is in that zone. If it hits the blade, it records the strike. If it doesn't hit the blade, it records the bird transect. So they've developed software that goes through all the footage and identifies these targets, so that somebody, like some poor grad student, doesn't have to sit there for days and days and days going through video. But anyway, so the other thing I'll mention is that they only had, I think it was operational for a year, and apparently they only had one strike. But that's, again, that's the nearshore environment. So, in terms of significant impacts, it's unlikely to have significant impacts on land birds on the outer continental shelf. There may be some times when land birds get out there, which they do. And we can probably predict those events by just tracking the weather or by using radar. And if it looks like there's a bunch of land birds headed out there, we might be able to do a shutdown. We ought to be able to work with the navigation lights so that we can minimize impacts. And as I've been talking about, we don't know how those deep water dynamic soaring birds are going to respond. If it looks like there could be issues, for example, if a large flock of albatrosses or birds occur in a project area, we detect that, we can do a turbine shutdown like terrestrial systems do. So, because, as you all know, food is so patchy and ephemeral out there that it's unlikely that you would have a system where you have a bunch of birds out in one spot for a long time. I will say too that if we find out that there are significant impacts to these dynamic soaring birds, there are some potential mitigation measures that we can do to offset those losses. And virtually all of these birds breed on islands. And most of them breed on islands that were predator-free for the evolution of the occurrence of them breeding on an island. And now all those islands have introduced predators that hammer these birds. So originally started in New Zealand and now being employed in Hawaii are these very amazing predator isolated fence systems that keep predators out of the nesting colonies. And they keep cats, snakes, mongooses, everything out of there. And the population response is immediate and profound, basically. These birds the population takes off in these protected areas. So most of the species that we're talking about off California come from, islands somewhere in the Pacific. And I'm sure there would be opportunities to help offset and augment the populations. The other thing is, they're still working on methodology to reduce bycatch, but it's possible that might be another mechanism that could be used to try to offset any losses that are significant. And just to let you know that we are actually doing this in Hawaii for an endangered species, a threatened species, the newel shearwater. And we basically, David Ainley did the modeling, et cetera, and built a predator exclusion fence, used avian decoys and broadcasts in a place that was not currently occupied as a colony. And what was supposed to happen is the first year that was out there with broadcasting, that the 2-year-old birds, the young birds that don't breed, but they prospect. So they come in to the island, they're looking for colonies that they can join when they're ready to breed. And those birds showed up. And then the next year, then we actually had breeding. So it works. Okay, so just a quick summary. We don't think offshore wind, at least over the OCS, is going to be a major issue with land birds. It might occasionally. Current LIDAR data are not extrapolatable to many of the species off California. We don't know how these dynamic soaring birds are going to respond to turbines. And if risk turns out to be significant, minimization and mitigation measures may be possible. And here's 2 links if anybody's interested in getting more information. So I think that's it.
So it looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
So after you've done the initial modeling for the risk assessment, are there plans to extend that modeling to consider potential changes, climate changes and things like that, that would change distributions and potentially even incorporate higher wind speeds and even bring in potentially some other species?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And actually, we have not talked about doing that at this stage. I think but that would be a great idea for the next step. And the reason I'm saying we may not want to do that as part of this initial study is because what we need for the environmental documentation is existing conditions. And so, in terms of placing these sites right now. But in terms of, I think that would be a very good next step. And
Is the risk assessment a look and see just to get a feel for what, like, I guess you would call it a kill factor would be? Is that it?
Yeah, it's to identify, so it would be a way to identify areas off the coast that would be based on those 3 levels of data or 3 sets of data. Areas that look like they would be bad spots to put wind farms because there are rare species there or large concentrations of birds that do the dynamic soaring. And there's definitely hot spots off California. So
I I just wondered how, I have no idea, but do you know in advance what an acceptable reduction factor would be?
No. It depends on the species, and so, for example, if a Hawaiian petrel or a short-tailed albatross hit, then that would be a major impact. For example, if fishermen accidentally kill 2 short-tailed albatrosses up off Alaska, then I think they shut them down for 5 years. So it's pretty substantial. So, you know, and it depends on the species and the population. The other thing I wanted to mention about the hotspots is there are a number of species off California that do not fly high that are also, you know, birds off Europe. So if you have a hotspot for like Alcid's common murres or something like that, that may show as a hotspot, but because they don't fly high, they should fall out of the model as being part of the risk. So it's important to look at not only species composition, but take the bird flight height data and look at that as well. So it tells us which species might be at risk and where.
And when, the slide that was just before that, could you just put the scale, like, I couldn't tell how big a human would be in that.
Yeah, so the offshore wind turbines that are being designed are humongous. They are 10 times bigger than the biggest terrestrial right now, turbines.
Are there people up there?
Well, if there were, they would be about like this.
Wow.
Is that a floating one?
Yeah, I think that is. So the principal power of the platform they use is based on oil. I mean, that's where they got the modeling for oil stuff. But let's see. So right now, you know, these big terrestrial ones that you see, some of the bigger ones are 2 megawatt, I think. And they're looking at 10 offshore and 12. And then there's even some thought of going to 20. So they're huge. And just really quickly, one thing I didn't mention, and sorry, backtracking a little bit, but when we talk about significant impacts, I tend to sort of focus on collision. But in Europe, you know, since they're not seeing a lot of collision or they're not detecting it, they're more worried about displacement. So birds being forced out of foraging areas or having to spend energy going around these wind farms. And I think that's a bigger issue near shore because the near shore environment is more restricted, right, than the environment of the outer continental shelf. So, and David agrees with this, if birds are offshore going around turbines, it's probably less of a potential effect than the nearshore birds that are being forced out beyond sort of their nearshore environment.
Like in a 40 or 50 knot wind, would those blades be a blur?
That's a good question, and I don't know. I don't know on that size blade. So the small blades that were part of the original terrestrial wind project at Altamont were small and they spun very rapidly, and we couldn't see them and the birds couldn't see them either. As part of the settlement between the Audubon Society and the county in terms of the Altamont Wind project, they're repowering. So they're going to these bigger, you know, the bigger turbines, and it does associate with a reduction in fatalities. So, you know, we can see them better the bigger they are, and the birds can too. There's still fatalities, but they're reduced. And so as they get bigger, then the turbine's relative speed, of course, is different at the base and the tip, but it's more visible. So I'm assuming, but I don't know this because I haven't actually seen an analysis, I'm assuming that they'll be more visible.
Yeah, I would assume so. If you look at the ones in the Salinas Valley, there's a couple big ones in there now. And when the wind's blowing really hard, it's not a blur. I mean, it takes a lot of energy to get those things to move.
Yeah.
And
And yeah, like I said, on terrestrial, there's still, you know, having some issues with bird strikes, even with the bigger turbines at this point.
You kind of touched on this when you mentioned Audubon, you know, litigation. So if the risks do turn out to be significant, who's responsible for the mitigation and minimization, and how enforceable is that? I mean, once these things are built, it seems like it's already a pretty big investment.
Yeah. So the environmental documentation, NEPA, the NEPA process, and in this case, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and or DOE would be the lead agency, or they might have a joint. And that document would be required to come up with impacts and assess whether those impacts are significant. And
is that on a continual annual basis?
Monitoring can be required. So in this case, since we don't know how these birds are going to respond, monitoring is going to be required. And the NEPA document, or the documents in California, also we have CEQA, but this is in federal waters. But there will be transmission cables that need to make a landing and all of that. So that the state will be responsible for the documentation for that as well. Probably a joint California federal document. And that will require that if they'll have scenarios in there, probably that say that if 2 black-footed albatrosses are taken, then the project proponent will be responsible for funding, some sort of mitigation measure. So it's required that these regulatory agencies spell out exactly what the mitigation is going to be. So even if it's contingent, it still has to be spelled out. So if you get in a situation where your take is exceeding what the expectations were, then they may have a provision, they may have a mitigation measure that says you have to shut down the turbines until we figure out what's going on. So.
And in your opinion, are those, is that being put, you kind of mentioned there's a gold rush going on off of Humboldt, So do you think it's being tempered appropriately with those in place? It could be shut down.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, right now what's going on is that there were 5 companies competing for a lease with the Redwood Coast Authority off Humboldt, and one was picked. And so it's very early in the stage. Now these other ones can apply for a competitive lease, which means it would be competition for that site. But one of the very first steps is to do an environmental assessment of just the lease issuance. And then that would require whoever wins the lease to do the biological characterization of the site. And the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has a team of scientists, and they would examine the characterization or review it and make sure it passed, it qualified. So and then when the impacts and mitigation measures and all of that come in the stage where they do the final site-specific permitting process. And so how many turbines where and all of that. But we just had 2 days of meetings in Sacramento, sponsored by the California Energy Commission, in which all the regulators were there, all of the developers were there, and then the next day we did a regulatory workshop for the regulators where we went over all of this. So we're getting the information out there that this is a different environment than Europe. A lot of developers are European.
It's done. I have a question, and it's going to be our last